You have 48 hours to pay me $4,200, Calvin, or I'm bulldozing that eyesore you call a cabin into splinters.
That's what Brenda Caldwell hissed at me 3 days ago, standing in my driveway in designer boots, pointing her manicured finger at the mountain retreat I'd built with my own hands. Now I'm standing here in the bitter cold, staring at exactly what she promised. Splintered wood, crushed furniture, and deep bulldozer tracks ripping through where my front door used to be. The air still reeks of diesel and total destruction. I said no to her fake dues because this land isn't even under HOA control. She smirked and sent the bulldozers anyway. She thought she'd won. She had no idea this property is federally protected land. What happened next changed everything for her. Forever. If someone bulldozed your home over bogus rules, would you just walk away or make sure they face the consequences? Where are you watching from, and what's your worst HOA horror story? The craziest ones get pinned. I need to hear them. Let me back up and tell you who I am. My name's Calvin Brewster, Cal to my friends, and I'm 62 years old. Spent 28 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, mostly blowing things up professionally. Bridges, bunkers, you name it. When Uncle Sam was done with me, I came home to find my wife had decided she was done with me too. Divorce took the house, most of my savings, and damn near broke my spirit. That cabin I just showed you, I built it myself, board by board, as therapy. Every hammer strike on every nail was like putting my life back together piece by piece. The sound of that hammer hitting home, the smell of fresh pine lumber, the rough texture of cabin walls under my calloused hands. It was the only thing keeping me sane after my world fell apart. My son's been deployed overseas for 3 years now. Haven't talked much since the divorce. So it was just me and my aging German Shepherd, Rex, up there in those mountains. The cabin sat on 5 acres I'd bought with my disability pension savings. Nothing fancy. Solar panels, a well, propane heat, off-grid simple living. It overlooked this pristine mountain lake, surrounded by about 40 other seasonal cabins. Most folks only came up on weekends or summers. I lived there full-time. Now, here's where our villain enters the story. Brenda Caldwell, mid-40s, real estate agent who'd appointed herself president of our little community's Homeowners Association. Picture this woman, perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, driving a white luxury SUV with Live Laugh Love stickers covering the back window. She wore designer athleisure everywhere, even to intimidate people, and talked in that fake sweet voice that barely concealed pure venom underneath. Brenda had decided she was the queen of our mountain community. And I use the term Homeowners Association loosely because there was never any actual legal formation, no bylaws, no elections. Brenda just decided she was in charge and started sending people bills with the authority of someone who'd watched too many episodes of Real Housewives. Which brings us to the letter that started this whole mess. February 15th, I walk out to my mailbox and find this certified letter waiting. Pink envelope, because of course it was pink, with urgent, immediate payment required stamped across it in gold foil. Inside, Brenda's demanding $4,200 in emergency HOA dues for quote-unquote critical lake access road repairs and environmental compliance upgrades. 48 hours to pay or else. Now, I've been around long enough to smell bullshit from a mile away, and this letter reeked of it. No itemized breakdown of costs, no HOA meeting minutes, no contractor quotes. Just pay up or face immediate property compliance actions, written in that passive-aggressive tone that screamed suburban tyrant. I tried calling the number on the letterhead, got Brenda's assistant, who basically told me to pay up or shut up in the sweetest possible voice. When I asked for documentation of these repairs, she giggled, actually giggled, and said Brenda would circle back with me. That's when I knew I was dealing with a scammer in designer workout clothes, not a legitimate HOA. Problem was, I didn't know how deep this rabbit hole went. See, I was living on a fixed disability pension. $4,200 might not sound like much to some folks, but for me, that was 3 months of groceries and utilities. But here's the thing about us old engineers. We don't back down from a fight, especially when someone's trying to run a con game while wearing yoga pants and fake eyelashes. I figured Brenda was counting on people like me just paying up rather than fighting. Seasonal visitors who didn't want the hassle. Elderly folks on fixed incomes who couldn't afford lawyers. Well, Brenda Caldwell was about to learn that this particular veteran wasn't going anywhere. and she sure as hell wasn't paying for imaginary road repairs to fund someone's designer handbag addiction. The morning after I got that letter, I hear the rumble of heavy machinery coming up my access road. I look out my kitchen window and see Brenda's white SUV followed by a massive yellow bulldozer on a trailer. My German Shepherd Rex starts growling. That dog's got good instincts about trouble. Brenda climbs down from her SUV in designer boots that had probably never touched actual dirt before today, wearing a hard hat that looked like it came straight from a photo shoot. She strutted up to my porch with her clipboard and that fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning, Calvin," she says in that sugar-sweet voice that made my teeth ache. "I'm here about your overdue assessment. You've got 24 hours to settle up, or we're going to have to start property cleanup operations." Property cleanup operations. Like my cabin was some kind of eyesore that needed removing from her perfect little kingdom. I stepped out onto my porch, keeping my voice calm. "Brenda, I need to see documentation for these repairs. Contractor quotes, HOA meeting minutes, something official." She laughed. That tinkling little laugh that probably worked on country club committees but just sounded fake as hell up here in the mountains. "Oh, sweetie, this is all the documentation you need." She tapped her manicured nails on the clipboard. "Emergency powers, honey. When there's a threat to community safety and property values, the HOA board can act immediately." "What board? Who else is on this board of yours?" Her smile got a little tighter around the edges. "That's not your concern, Calvin. Your concern is $4,200 by tomorrow, or that rustic little structure comes down. We're trying to maintain standards here." The way she said rustic made it sound like a disease. This woman looked at my hand-built cabin, 20 years of sweat equity and craftsmanship, and saw nothing but a property value problem that needed solving. Now, I'm not one to back down from a bully, but I'm also not stupid. This woman had a bulldozer and clearly no problem using it. So I decided to do what any good engineer does when facing unknown territory: gather intelligence. After Brenda left in a cloud of designer perfume and diesel exhaust, I grabbed my old surveying equipment from the shed. 28 years in the Corps teaches you to always know exactly where you stand, literally and legally. I started marking the boundaries of my property, following the description from my deed. That's when I found them. Old concrete boundary markers, maybe 18 inches tall, set deep in the ground. They were weathered and covered with moss, but when I cleaned them off, I could make out something interesting carved into the concrete. An eagle. Not just any eagle, the federal eagle emblem. Now, I'd seen markers like this before during my Army days, usually meant government land, but my deed clearly stated this was private property. So what were federal markers doing on my boundary line? I spent the rest of that day researching property records at the county courthouse. The clerk was this sweet elderly lady who'd been working there since the Carter administration. She pulled out maps and surveys going back to the 1950s. "Oh, honey," she said, adjusting her reading glasses, "you might want to look at the Federal Land Office too. Sometimes these mountain properties have complicated histories." Complicated histories. That phrase was about to become very important. When I got home that evening, I found Brenda's business card stuck in my door with a handwritten note in pink ink. "Last chance, Calvin. Payment due by 9 a.m. tomorrow or cleanup begins. XOXO Brenda." She'd actually drawn a little heart over the I in her name. This woman was treating the destruction of my home like a social media post. The next morning, sure enough, I wake up to the sound of diesel engines. But this time, Brenda brought friends. 2 more SUVs, a crew of guys in hard hats who looked uncomfortable taking orders from someone in designer athleisure, and that same bulldozer, now off the trailer and ready for action. I walked out to meet them at my property line, right where those federal eagle markers were buried in the moss and dirt. "Time's up, Calvin, sweetie," Brenda called out from beside her bulldozer, her voice still fake sweet but with steel underneath. "You had your chance to do this the easy way." "Hold on there, Brenda. You sure you want to start digging around here?" "Don't try to intimidate me with your military act, honey. This is civilian property and you're in violation of HOA regulations. We're just trying to help the community maintain its standards." I knelt down and brushed the moss off one of those concrete markers, making sure Brenda could see that federal eagle emblem clearly. "You recognize this symbol, Brenda?" For just a second, I saw uncertainty flicker behind those fake eyelashes, but her ego was bigger than her common sense. "I don't care what some old marker says, Calvin. You owe money, and I have the authority to collect it. Rules are rules." That afternoon, I had to drive down to the VA medical center for my monthly appointment. Routine stuff, blood pressure, medication check, the usual drill for us old soldiers. The appointment ran long, like they always do, so I didn't get back to the cabin until almost 6 p.m. The smell hit me first. Diesel exhaust mixed with sawdust and something else. The scent of destruction. Then I saw it. Or rather, I saw what wasn't there anymore. My cabin was gone, completely flattened. 20 years of work reduced to a pile of splintered lumber and twisted metal. The concrete foundation was cracked and broken like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it with malicious intent. Brenda hadn't just demolished my home. She'd obliterated it with the thoroughness of someone who really enjoyed other people's pain. I sat in my truck for a long time, just staring at the wreckage. Rex whined from the passenger seat, sensing something was wrong. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the debris field that used to be my sanctuary. Mrs. Henderson from the cabin next door came running over, wringing her hands and looking absolutely distraught. "Oh, Cal, I'm so sorry. I tried to call you, but I didn't have your number." That Caldwell woman came back with her crew around noon. She was directing everything like some kind of demolition queen, taking photos with her phone and everything. Taking photos. Brenda had documented the destruction of my home like it was a home renovation project for Instagram. "Did she say anything else, Mrs. Henderson?" "She told everyone it was an emergency compliance action and that you'd been properly notified. Then she handed out business cards to the crew and told them there were 6 more cabins scheduled for upgrades this month. She said mine might need improvements, too." Her voice cracked with worry. 6 more cabins. This wasn't just about my $4,200. This was a systematic operation run by a woman who'd turned property destruction into a business model. That night, I slept in my truck with Rex, parked right there in front of the rubble that used to be my home. The crunch of broken glass under my boots when I walked around the debris pile was like nails on a chalkboard. But I wasn't leaving. This was still my land, and I was going to figure out exactly what Brenda had stepped into. First thing the next morning, I drove straight to the federal land office in the county seat. It's one of those government buildings that looks exactly like what it is. Concrete block construction, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of bureaucracy. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged guy named Dennis, who looked like he'd been dealing with property disputes since before I was born. "You said you found federal boundary markers?" he asked, pulling out a thick binder of maps. "Yes, sir. Concrete posts with the federal eagle emblem right along my property line." Dennis spread out a survey map dated 1952 and traced his finger along the boundaries. "Well, I'll be damned. You're sitting on what we call a federal in-holding." "A what now?" "Private property completely surrounded by national forest land. It happens when the government buys up large tracts but leaves certain parcels in private hands. Your 5 acres, plus about 12 other cabin lots in your area, they're all federal in-holdings." Dennis pulled out another map, this one more recent. "See, everything around you, and I mean everything, belongs to the U.S. Forest Service. Has since 1953. Your property is like an island in a sea of federal land." The implications hit me like a freight train. So, when Brenda bulldozed my cabin, if any part of her operation crossed onto federal forest land, that's automatic federal jurisdiction. U.S. Forest Service has its own law enforcement division. They don't mess around with property crimes on government land, especially when it involves fraud. Dennis made a few photocopies of the maps and handed them to me. "You might want to document any damage to federal boundary markers, too. Destroying those is a federal felony." I drove back up to my property with a whole new understanding of the situation. Brenda thought she was dealing with a local property dispute that she could handle with designer boots and fake authority. What she'd actually done was commit federal crimes on government land. I spent the afternoon walking my property line with a camera, documenting every boundary marker. Sure enough, Brenda's bulldozer tracks crossed the federal line in 3 different places. Her crew had used federal forest land as a staging area, dumping debris from my cabin onto government property like it was their personal construction dumpster. That evening, Mrs. Henderson knocked on my truck window, holding another pink envelope. "Cal, I got another letter from that woman today. She wants $3,800 for emergency environmental compliance by Friday, and she's calling it a neighborhood beautification fee." And I looked at that pink letter with its gold foil stamping and smiled for the first time since seeing my cabin destroyed. Mrs. Henderson, I think you can throw that letter away. Brenda's about to have much bigger problems than collecting fake fees. By Friday morning, Brenda was making good on her threats with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this before. I watched from my truck as she rolled up to the Peterson cabin 3 lots over with her whole entourage. The Petersons were an elderly couple from Phoenix who only came up for summers. Their cabin was small but well-maintained, with a little flower garden that Mrs. Peterson tended every weekend. Brenda's approach was the same theatrical performance she'd perfected. Show up with the bulldozer, make demands in that fake sweet voice, threaten demolition with a smile. But this time, I was ready. I'd spent the week making phone calls and copying documents. The Federal Land Office put me in touch with a Forest Service law enforcement officer named Agent Sarah Mitchell. She was one of those no-nonsense federal agents who dealt with plenty of property crime on government land. Mr. Brewster, she'd told me over the phone, if what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at multiple federal violations. Destruction of federal property markers, unauthorized use of government land, and potentially fraud if she's been collecting fees without legal authority. I was documenting Brenda's operation when I heard her voice carrying across the mountain air, that sugar-sweet tone that always preceded someone's day getting ruined. Now, Mr. Peterson, sweetie, I understand this is a lot of money, but environmental compliance isn't optional. $3,800 for immediate upgrades, or we'll have to handle this the difficult way. The old man was trying to explain that he didn't have that kind of cash on hand, that he'd need time to get to his bank in Phoenix. Brenda wasn't interested in reasonable explanations. Oh, honey, I wish I could give you more time, but regulations are regulations. Environmental violations pose an immediate threat to our beautiful community. We simply can't allow substandard structures to compromise everyone else's property values. That's when I noticed something that made my blood boil. Brenda was specifically targeting the veteran families and elderly folks on fixed incomes. The weekend warriors with money, the guys who drove up from the city in their expensive RVs, somehow their cabins never needed these urgent environmental upgrades. I walked over to where Brenda was lecturing Mr. Peterson about community standards, making sure my camera was recording everything. Having some collection problems, Brenda? She spun around, her perfectly styled hair somehow managing to bounce in slow motion. Calvin, you're trespassing on private property. Leave immediately, or I'll have you arrested for harassment. Actually, Brenda, I've been researching property law this week. Fascinating stuff. Did you know that when private property is completely surrounded by federal land, it's called an inholding? And did you know that gives federal authorities automatic jurisdiction over property crimes? I could see the wheels turning behind those fake eyelashes, but her entitled confidence was still driving the bus. I don't care what you think you learned from some government website, honey. This is local HOA business, and you're interfering with official community improvement operations. I pulled out the photocopied maps Dennis had given me and spread them on the hood of my truck. These are the original 1952 federal land surveys, Brenda. Everything around us, your staging areas, your equipment routes, probably half the places you've been operating, it's all federal forest land. For the first time, I saw real uncertainty flicker across her face, but she was in too deep to back down now, and admitting ignorance would damage her carefully cultivated image of absolute authority. You're bluffing, Calvin. Even if that's true, I have grandfather rights through my real estate license. I've been managing properties up here for years. Grandfather rights don't apply to criminal activity on federal property, Brenda. And speaking of your real estate business, I found something interesting when I was researching property records. I pulled out another document, Brenda's business registration with the state. Your LLC lists this area as a primary service location for property management. Problem is, you've been conducting commercial operations on federal forest land without any permits or authorization. The color drained from beneath her foundation makeup. She was starting to realize that her little kingdom might not be as legally solid as she'd thought. That's impossible. I've been working with local authorities for years. I have all the proper documentation. I'm sure you have plenty of documentation, Brenda. The question is whether any of it's worth the paper it's printed on when federal agents start asking questions about jurisdiction. Mr. Peterson had been listening to our conversation with growing amazement. Are you saying this woman has no legal authority to collect fees from us? Mr. Peterson, I'm saying Brenda here has been running a fraud operation on federal property, and when she destroyed my cabin yesterday, she left evidence of federal crimes all over government land. Brenda was sweating now despite the cool mountain air and her moisture-wicking athleisure fabric. You can't prove any of that, Calvin. I smiled and held up my camera. Actually, I've got photos, audio recordings, and federal land surveys. Plus, I've been in contact with U.S. Forest Service law enforcement. That's when Brenda made her biggest mistake yet. Instead of backing down, instead of trying to negotiate her way out of the hole she'd dug, she doubled down with the fury of someone whose authority had never been challenged. That phone call to Agent Mitchell changed everything. But the real game changer came 3 days later when she called me back with news that made my head spin. Mr. Brewster, I need you to sit down for this. We ran a full title search on your area, cross-referenced with federal land records going back to 1952. What we found is bigger than just your property dispute. I was sitting in my truck, parked at what used to be my cabin, when she delivered the bombshell. Your property and 12 others in your immediate area are confirmed federal inholdings. But here's the kicker. Brenda Caldwell's been collecting what she calls HOA dues and compliance fees from property owners on federal land for the past 4 years. That's federal mail fraud, wire fraud, and theft of services on government property. She paused to let that sink in. We've also confirmed that her entire business operation, the equipment staging, the contractor coordination, even the access routes she uses to reach properties, it all crosses federal forest land without any permits or authorization. I felt like I was watching dominoes line up, ready to fall. So what does that mean exactly? It means Brenda Caldwell has been committing federal crimes for years, and when she destroyed your cabin, she did it by coordinating illegal operations on government property and dumping the debris on federal forest land. We're talking about violations under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, environmental crimes, and about 6 other federal statutes. Agent Mitchell's voice took on that tone federal agents get when they're about to drop the hammer. Mr. Brewster, this case just became a federal priority. We're not just talking about property destruction anymore. We're talking about systematic fraud, environmental crimes, and organized criminal activity targeting veterans on federal land. The implications were staggering. Brenda thought she was running some sophisticated property management business with her fake HOA authority. What she'd actually done was build a criminal enterprise that specifically targeted military families and elderly folks who couldn't fight back. There's more, Agent Mitchell continued. We contacted other property owners in your area. Brenda's collected over $89,000 in fake assessments, compliance fees, and environmental upgrades from 18 different families over the past 4 years. Most of them paid rather than fight because they were afraid of losing their cabins. $89,000. Brenda had been running this scam for years with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how to exploit people's fears and financial vulnerabilities. What happens now? Now we build a federal case. Mail fraud, wire fraud, destruction of federal property, environmental crimes, extortion under color of authority. Brenda's looking at serious federal prison time, but I need your help to document everything properly. That evening, I called Mrs. Henderson and the Petersons. Word spread quickly through the small community of year-round residents. We'd all been dealing with Brenda's threats individually, feeling helpless against what seemed like legitimate authority backed by legal paperwork and professional presentation. Turns out there was nothing legitimate about Brenda's operation at all. The federal agents had jurisdiction over everything she'd been doing. The fake HOA had no legal standing. The emergency assessments were pure fraud, and every time she'd threatened someone with demolition, she'd been committing extortion under federal law. For 4 years, Brenda had been counting on her victims staying isolated and intimidated by her fake authority and professional appearance. Now they were talking to each other, comparing notes, sharing evidence of her systematic targeting of vulnerable families. And me? Well, I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a federal witness with intimate knowledge of Brenda's operation and the military training to document everything properly. Brenda Caldwell was about to learn what happens when you run a criminal enterprise on federal property and mess with the wrong veteran. Agent Mitchell and I met at the federal building in town 2 days later. She'd brought a whole team. Another Forest Service agent, someone from the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and a federal prosecutor who looked like she prosecuted criminals for breakfast and ate their appeals for lunch. Mr. Brewster, the prosecutor said, spreading photos across the conference table. We need your help to build an airtight case. You understand federal property boundaries, you've got documentation of the crimes, and you know Brenda's operation better than anyone. They showed me surveillance photos of Brenda's staging areas. Turns out federal agents had been watching her operation for the past week, documenting every contractor meeting and equipment movement on government land. Here's what we know, Agent Mitchell said, pointing to an aerial map. Brenda's been using approximately 12 acres of federal forest land as her equipment staging and contractor coordination area. No permits, no authorization, no rental payments to the government. The FBI agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Torres, pulled out a financial analysis that would have impressed a forensic accountant. We've traced $89,000 in fraudulent HOA assessments and compliance fees collected over 4 years. Money went straight into accounts controlled by Brenda and her property management LLC. But here's where my engineering background became crucial. They needed someone who understood both federal property law and construction operations to help them build the physical evidence case. We need to document the exact moment Brenda commits her next federal crime, the prosecutor explained. Catch her in the act, on camera, with federal agents present as witnesses. That's when I told them about the concrete barriers. See, during my Army days, we used what we called tank traps, concrete obstacles designed to stop heavy vehicles dead in their tracks. The principle was simple: create an immovable object that would high-center any vehicle trying to cross it. I can build barriers along the exact federal property line, I explained. Completely legal on my property, invisible until someone tries to cross with heavy equipment. When Brenda brings contractors onto federal land, their equipment will be stuck there until federal agents arrive. Agent Mitchell smiled with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated elegant solutions. Trapped on federal property with no way to claim they were operating legally. I like it. The technical details were straightforward. I'd pour reinforced concrete barriers 18 inches underground, positioned exactly on the federal boundary line. The barriers would be shaped like tank obstacles, angled concrete teeth that would catch the undercarriage of any heavy equipment and lift the machine off the ground. From the surface, they'd be completely invisible, just looked like the natural terrain. But when a bulldozer hit them, the machine would high center permanently. No going forward, no backing up, stuck until a crane could lift it free. The beauty of this, I explained to the team, is that Brenda will trigger the trap at the exact moment her contractors commit the federal crime of operating heavy equipment on government property. Agent Torres loved the poetic justice with an appreciation that suggested she'd seen plenty of criminals hoist by their own petards. Her tool of intimidation becomes the evidence of her crime. Over the next week, I worked with a federal surveyor to mark the exact property boundaries. Every barrier had to be positioned perfectly, on my private property, but at the precise line where contractors would cross onto federal land. The concrete work took 3 days. I mixed each batch carefully, embedding steel reinforcement bars for maximum strength. The barriers were engineered to stop a 30-ton bulldozer dead in its tracks while being completely invisible to anyone who didn't know they were there. Meanwhile, Agent Mitchell coordinated with the Forest Service Law Enforcement Division. They positioned remote cameras throughout the federal forest around Brenda's operation. Every crime she committed would be documented from multiple angles with timestamps and GPS coordinates. The federal team also reached out to other property owners Brenda had targeted: Mrs. Henderson, the Petersons, 4 other veteran families. Everyone agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation, and several had kept detailed records of Brenda's threats and demands. Brenda's pattern is to escalate quickly with fake urgency, I told the agents. She demands immediate payment, then threatens demolition within 48 hours. When people can't pay fast enough, she shows up with contractors and equipment. Agent Torres had been monitoring Brenda's communications and business activities. She's already sent letters to 5 more families demanding payments by this Friday. She's planning what she calls a comprehensive community upgrade project. The timing was perfect. Brenda would coordinate her contractors, stage equipment on federal land, and attempt to demolish properties using her illegal operation as a base. The moment heavy equipment crossed the federal boundary line, it would trigger my concrete trap and find operators surrounded by federal agents. One more thing, the prosecutor added with a grim smile that suggested she'd prosecuted plenty of white-collar criminals. When we arrest Brenda and her contractors, we're seizing all equipment on federal land as evidence. Everything becomes government property until the case is resolved. Friday morning came with the sound I'd been expecting. Diesel engines rumbling up the mountain access road, but this time with an additional soundtrack of Brenda's voice barking orders like a general coordinating a military campaign. I was positioned about 200 yards away with a clear view of the trap zone, my camera ready and Agent Mitchell on speed dial. The federal agents were stationed throughout the forest, close enough to respond within minutes, but far enough away to let Brenda walk into her own trap. Brenda's convoy was impressive, in a criminal sort of way. Her white luxury SUV leading the parade, followed by a massive yellow bulldozer on a trailer, 2 smaller excavators, and a dump truck. But what really caught my attention was the professional crew she'd assembled. 6 contractors in matching hard hats, all taking orders from a woman in designer athleisure who'd never operated heavy equipment in her life. But there was something different about this operation. Brenda had hired actual professionals this time, experienced operators who knew their business but had no idea they were about to become accessories to federal crimes on government property. I watched through binoculars as Brenda gathered her crew for what looked like a corporate presentation in the middle of the forest. She was pointing at a map mounted on an easel, gesturing toward different cabins with a laser pointer, clearly coordinating a multi-target demolition campaign with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Mrs. Henderson's cabin was first on the list. The sweet elderly lady who couldn't afford Brenda's fake fees was about to lose her weekend retreat unless federal justice intervened. Brenda directed the lead contractor to unload the bulldozer in her usual staging area, right in the middle of federal forest land. The operator fired up the machine, diesel smoke billowing as he positioned it for the assault on Mrs. Henderson's property, completely unaware that he was committing federal crimes under Brenda's direction. That's when I made the first call to Agent Mitchell. "They're here. Bulldozer is staging on federal property, just like we predicted. Professional crew this time." "Copy that. All units are standing by. Let them commit to the crime before we move." Brenda walked over to Mrs. Henderson's cabin in her designer boots and started banging on the door with the confidence of someone who'd perfected this intimidation routine. The poor woman came out looking terrified, clutching a coffee cup with shaking hands. "Good morning, Margaret, sweetie," Brenda called out in that fake friendly voice that made my skin crawl. "Time's up on your environmental compliance payment. $3,800 right now, or we start the upgrade process immediately." Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely audible from my position, but I could see her gesturing helplessly toward her purse, probably explaining again that she simply didn't have that kind of money available on short notice. "Oh, honey, I understand money can be tight on a fixed income," Brenda's voice carried clearly across the mountain air, "but environmental violations are serious business. We simply can't allow substandard structures to compromise our beautiful community any longer." She turned toward the bulldozer operator and made a throat-slitting gesture with one manicured finger. The universal sign for "tear it down," delivered with a smile that would have impressed a shark. The operator hesitated, looking uncomfortable with the order. Even from my distance, I could see him glancing between Brenda and Mrs. Henderson, probably wondering how destroying an elderly woman's cabin while she stood there begging qualified as environmental improvement. But Brenda wasn't tolerating any hesitation from her hired help. "Operator, we're on a schedule here. Mrs. Henderson has been properly notified, and we have 5 more properties to upgrade today." 5 more properties. Brenda was planning a demolition spree that would destroy half the veteran and elderly families in our community, all while documenting it for her business portfolio. The operator engaged the bulldozer's tracks and started moving toward Mrs. Henderson's cabin. To reach it, he'd have to cross the exact spot where I'd buried my concrete tank traps along the federal property line. I made the second call to Agent Mitchell. "Bulldozer is moving toward the federal boundary line. Operator appears to be a legitimate contractor, probably doesn't know he's committing federal crimes." "Understood. We'll take that into consideration during arrest procedures." The massive yellow machine rumbled forward, the operator carefully navigating between the pine trees with the skill of someone who'd spent years moving heavy equipment through difficult terrain. He was treating the job professionally, which made it even more tragic that Brenda was using his expertise for criminal purposes. Unfortunately for everyone involved, professional skill doesn't protect you from federal property boundaries hidden 18 inches underground. The bulldozer approached the invisible line where my concrete barriers waited like sleeping giants in the earth. From the operator's perspective, it just looked like normal forest floor. Pine needles, fallen branches, natural terrain that he'd crossed 1,000 times before on legitimate job sites. The sound of the bulldozer hitting my concrete barriers was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Picture a freight train derailing in slow motion, mixed with the screech of metal on concrete and the confused roar of a diesel engine suddenly working against physics instead of with it. The massive yellow machine lurched forward, then stopped dead as the concrete teeth caught the undercarriage and lifted the entire front end off the ground. The tracks spun uselessly in the air while the engine revved in mechanical confusion, and the operator shut down immediately like the professional he was. He climbed down to assess the situation, walking around the bulldozer and scratching his head under his hard hat, trying to figure out how he'd managed to high-center a 30-ton machine on what looked like flat ground. But Brenda's reaction was pure entitled fury mixed with the panic of someone whose carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed at the operator, her fake sweet voice completely abandoned. "How do you get stuck on flat ground? I'm not paying you to be incompetent." "Ma'am, I don't understand it either. Feels like I hit some kind of concrete barrier, but I don't see anything visible. This is really unusual." That's when Brenda started connecting the dots, her eyes sweeping the tree line until they found me standing calmly with my camera and cell phone, documenting everything with the patience of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Brewster!" Her voice echoed across the mountain valley with all the fury of a woman whose scam was falling apart in front of witnesses. "What did you do to my equipment?" I cupped my hands around my mouth and called back in my most helpful tone. "Nothing illegal, Brenda. That's the federal property line your contractor just crossed with heavy equipment." Even from 200 yards away, I could see Brenda's face turning red beneath her foundation makeup. She started marching toward me in those designer boots, pointing and screaming threats that would have made a drill sergeant proud. "You sabotaged my bulldozer. That's destruction of property. I'm having you arrested for interfering with legitimate business operations." I made my third call to Agent Mitchell. "Subject has confirmed federal property violation with heavy equipment and is now threatening a federal witness. Recommend immediate intervention." "Copy that. All units, move in." But Brenda wasn't done making mistakes. Instead of trying to extract the bulldozer and retreat like a rational criminal, she doubled down with the desperate fury of someone whose entire business model was collapsing. "You!" she screamed at the other contractors. "Get the excavator! We'll dig that machine out and finish this job! Nobody's stopping this community improvement project!" The excavator operator looked uncertain, glancing between his stuck colleague and the increasingly unhinged woman in designer athleisure who was demanding federal crimes. "Ma'am, maybe we should call a tow truck or something. I don't want to damage the equipment trying to force it." "Forget the equipment. We have a schedule to maintain. Mrs. Henderson's cabin comes down today, then we move to the Peterson place." Brenda pointed at Mrs. Henderson, who was standing in her doorway recording everything on her cell phone with the determination of someone who'd finally found her courage. "You! Stop recording and get your belongings out of that structure right now. We're tearing it down whether the bulldozer's stuck or not." That's when Mrs. Henderson did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of cowering, she stepped forward and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire worksite. "Ms. Caldwell, I'm documenting everything you're saying for federal law enforcement. You're threatening to destroy my property without legal authority, and you're doing it on federal land." Brenda lost whatever remained of her composure, revealing the entitled tyrant beneath the fake sweet exterior. "Give me that phone right now. You can't record official HOA business. I'll have you arrested for harassment." She actually lunged toward Mrs. Henderson, trying to grab her phone like a playground bully. The sweet elderly lady who'd been too scared to stand up to Brenda's demands was suddenly documenting federal crimes with the determination of an investigative reporter. "Excavator operator!" Brenda screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of professional authority. "Fire up that machine right now. We're digging out the bulldozer and finishing this job today." The poor contractor was trapped between his increasingly unhinged client and what was obviously becoming a federal law enforcement situation. I could see him looking around nervously, probably wondering how a simple demolition contract had turned into whatever this was becoming. But Brenda was beyond rational thought, driven by panic and rage. She climbed into the excavator herself, her designer boots slipping on the metal steps. "If you want something done right, do it yourself. I'm digging out that bulldozer, and then I'm tearing down every substandard cabin up here." That's when the first federal vehicles appeared at the top of the access road, emergency lights flashing like Christmas morning for justice. The sight of Brenda's massive yellow bulldozer high-centered on my concrete barriers, with its blade pointing skyward like some kind of defeated mechanical dinosaur, was pure poetic justice. Diesel smoke drifted from the exhaust stack, and the tracks hung motionless in the mountain air while Brenda frantically operated the excavator in designer boots. Agent Mitchell approached the scene with the confident stride of someone who'd been building this case for weeks. Behind her, 6 federal agents spread out in a tactical formation around the equipment staging area. Mrs. Henderson continued filming everything from her cabin porch, her hands steady now that help had arrived. "Brenda Caldwell," Agent Mitchell called out in a voice that carried the full authority of the federal government. "Shut off that equipment and step down with your hands visible." Brenda's response was exactly what I'd expected. Pure, entitled rage mixed with desperate denial, delivered in a voice that had completely abandoned any pretense of fake sweetness. "This is private property. You have no jurisdiction here. I'm conducting legitimate community improvement operations." Agent Mitchell smiled and held up the federal boundary maps with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a perfectly prepared legal haymaker. "Ms. Caldwell, you're currently operating heavy equipment on federal forest land without permits. Your bulldozer is stuck on government property, and you've just threatened federal witnesses in front of multiple agents." That's when Brenda made her final, fatal mistake. Instead of shutting up and calling a lawyer like any rational criminal, she kept digging her hole deeper with the fury of someone whose authority had never been seriously challenged. "That's sabotage. Brewster booby-trapped my equipment. I want him arrested for destruction of property and interference with legitimate business operations." I walked over to where Brenda's bulldozer sat trapped on the concrete barriers, making sure my voice carried to all the federal agents and Mrs. Henderson's camera. "Brenda, those concrete barriers are positioned exactly on the federal boundary line. They're on my private property, which is perfectly legal. But your bulldozer?" I gestured to the machine hanging helplessly above the barriers. "That's sitting on federal forest land without any permits or authorization." Agent Mitchell pulled out her handcuffs and started reading Brenda her rights with the professional efficiency of someone who'd arrested plenty of white-collar criminals. "Brenda Caldwell, you're under arrest for destruction of federal property, fraud, extortion under color of authority, and operating heavy equipment on government land without authorization." But Brenda still wasn't done making things worse for herself, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested complete detachment from reality. "You can't arrest me. I have connections. I'm a licensed real estate professional. I've been managing properties up here for years." Agent Torres stepped forward with a thick folder of documents and the grim expression of someone who'd spent weeks building an airtight case. "Ms. Caldwell, we've been investigating your property management business for the past 2 weeks. You've been conducting commercial operations on federal forest land without any permits or authorization. We've also documented $89,000 in fraudulent fees collected from 18 different property owners." The sound of more vehicles approaching echoed through the valley. This time it was local news crews. Someone had tipped off the media that federal agents were making arrests in connection with a fraud operation targeting veterans and elderly residents. Brenda's face went from red to ash gray as the TV cameras started rolling, capturing her in designer athleisure and handcuffs next to a bulldozer stuck on concrete barriers. "We're here at a remote mountain cabin community where federal agents have arrested a local property manager on charges of fraud and destruction of federal property," the reporter announced to her camera. "The suspect allegedly collected thousands of dollars in fake HOA fees from elderly residents and veterans before destroying their property using equipment illegally operated on government land." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, still clutching her phone but now speaking directly to the news cameras with the courage of someone whose oppressor was finally in handcuffs. "This woman threatened to destroy my home unless I paid her $3,800. She said she had legal authority, but it was all lies. And when poor Mr. Brewster questioned her fees, she had his entire cabin bulldozed while he was at the VA hospital." The reporter turned her microphone toward me, and I looked directly into the camera with the satisfaction of a veteran who'd finally seen justice served. "Ma'am, Cal Brewster, retired Army Corps of Engineers. What Ms. Caldwell didn't know was that this entire area is federal forest land, and federal authorities don't take kindly to criminals who target veterans on government property." Behind us, Brenda was still arguing with Agent Mitchell as the handcuffs clicked into place. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was maintaining community standards. These people weren't paying their fair share for improvements." Agent Mitchell's response was calm, professional, and devastating. "Ms. Caldwell, there is no legal HOA. You have no authority to collect fees, and you've been operating a criminal enterprise on federal property for 4 years." She turned toward the news cameras and held up the federal evidence folder. 6 months later, I'm sitting on the porch of my new cabin, watching the morning sunlight dance across the same mountain lake where this whole story began. The cabin's bigger than the original. Turns out the federal government is pretty generous when they're compensating victims of crimes committed on their property by someone who specifically targeted veterans. Brenda Caldwell got 4 years in federal prison. Turns out when you commit fraud, extortion, and property destruction on federal land while targeting military families, the government takes it very personally. Her property management business was liquidated to pay restitution, and she'll never hold a real estate license again. Mrs. Henderson got her $3,800 back, plus damages and interest. So did the Petersons and 16 other families who'd been scammed by Brenda's fake HOA operation. The federal court ordered total restitution of $123,000, plus legal fees and punitive damages. The contractors who'd been working for Brenda cooperated with federal prosecutors and received probation. Poor guys had just been following what they thought were legitimate work orders, not realizing they were operating equipment in a criminal enterprise on federal property. The fake HOA was officially dissolved, and our little community formed a real property owners association with actual bylaws, elected leadership, and transparent finances. Funny how much smoother things run when nobody's trying to scam their neighbors while wearing designer athleisure. But the best part of this whole story is what happened to our community afterward. The federal investigation brought us together in ways Brenda's intimidation never could have. We started looking out for each other, sharing resources, helping elderly neighbors with property maintenance that actually needed doing. Mrs. Henderson, that sweet lady who'd been too scared to stand up to Brenda's demands, became our association's first elected president. She runs monthly meetings like a retired school teacher managing a classroom, which it turns out she actually was. Nobody misses payment deadlines when Mrs. Henderson sends reminder notices, but at least they're for legitimate expenses with actual receipts. 3 months after Brenda's arrest, my son called me for the first time in 2 years. He'd seen the news coverage of the federal investigation and wanted to know if his old man was really taking down criminals with homemade tank traps and federal law enforcement. We talked for 3 hours that night, and he's coming home on leave next month to see the new cabin and meet Rex's replacement, a young German shepherd I named Justice. Even the original Rex seemed happier in his final months. That old dog had been stressed and anxious ever since the original cabin was destroyed, but he spent his last weeks napping in the sunshine, occasionally lifting his gray muzzle to watch for threats that never came anymore. The federal agents helped us establish a veterans property rights workshop that meets monthly at the community center. I teach other veterans about federal land law, property boundaries, and how to recognize fraud operations targeting military families. Agent Mitchell comes by quarterly to update us on new scams and enforcement actions. We've helped 8 other communities identify and report similar fraud schemes. Turns out, Brenda's operation wasn't unique. There are criminals all over the country targeting isolated property owners with fake authority and fraudulent fees, often specifically going after veterans and elderly folks who might not have resources to fight back. The concrete barriers that trapped Brenda's bulldozer, they're still there, right along the federal boundary line. I've turned them into planters for Mrs. Henderson's famous mountain wildflowers. Every spring, those barriers bloom with color, a beautiful reminder that justice can grow from the most unexpected places. Last week, a young veteran named Jessica bought the lot next to mine. She's planning to build a small cabin for herself and her 2 kids. When she asked about HOA fees and community regulations, I just smiled and handed her Mrs. Henderson's phone number. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I told her. "We look out for each other up here, and we don't tolerate scam artists in designer boots."
So Carl Brewster got his revenge. Brenda Caldwell got 4 years in federal prison for bulldozing the wrong veterans cabin. But here's what really matters about this story. Those federal boundary markers have been sitting there for 70 years, marking the exact line between legitimate authority and criminal fraud. Carl just had to brush off the moss to find them. That's the thing about bullies like Brenda. They're not masterminds, they're lazy opportunists. She built her whole scam on one simple bet, that people would rather pay $4,200 than spend 42 hours learning their rights. Real power isn't threats or clipboards, it's knowing exactly where you stand and asking the uncomfortable questions scammer hope you never think to ask. How many Brendas are operating in your neighborhood right now? Because 3 questions will stop most property scam cold. Show me the meeting minutes. Where are my boundaries? Who else got those letters? But most of us rather write a check than ask those questions. What if next time someone demands money with threats, you responded like car? Drop your HOA owner stories below. Why this one get featured? Hit subscribe for more justice served content. Remember, knowledge isn't just power, it's freedom.